Haidete o Philoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I talk with Kevin Grasso, one of the founders of Biblingo. Kevin's story is a bit different from some of the other people I've interviewed. He started out trying to apply communicative methods. He's also trying to bring insights from general linguistics into the Koine Greek world. We talk about second language acquisition theory and how this applies to learning ancient languages. There's some really great stuff in here. So without further ado, let's jump in. Well, hi, Kevin. Thanks for taking the time to chat. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Again, like I've done in a lot of these episodes, I think it's really helpful for people to see, hear stories of learners and how they've gotten from beginning to, a fairly high degree of competency, and in your case too, producing an app and language learning app in both Greek and Hebrew, which is really cool. So I'm sure your story will be interesting and helpful for people as they're trying to figure out, find their own way through learning Hebrew and, in this case, Greek. So again, thank you for agreeing to sit down and share some of your thoughts and experiences.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be on here and talk about Greek and Hebrew. So that's what I do.
So just specifically, I'll be talking about Greek, but if you have insights from Hebrew you think are relevant, please feel free to throw them in. But what got you interested in learning Greek in the beginning?
Yeah, so I really started learning it on my own in college as an undergrad. I was in a Hebrew class because, I had originally started with Hebrew because there was no room left in the Greek class. So I, said Hebrew is better than nothing. And so I was taking classes, like formal classes in Hebrew, and I was like, well, I need to learn Greek too. So I just started doing stuff on my own. I got Athenese and started working through that. But the whole kind of like impetus behind both Greek and Hebrew to begin with was really an interest in theological conversations that I realized I really could not participate in a meaningful way if I didn't know the languages. So for me, I was trying to engage with people that were claiming certain things about what a Greek word meant. And I said, well, if I don't know Greek, I can't engage, right, and have a real opinion about that conversation, without really knowing the language well. So that was kind of how I got into it. And obviously from there, I started getting into like, okay, I asked the question, how do I actually learn this language like well? And that led me down a different path that is not the traditional seminary path, but one I think is very fruitful.
So you said something interesting in there, and you may be like the first person I've had on the podcast that started with Athenese. Why did you pick that instead of like Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek? I'm assuming you were in, theologically oriented, seminary kind of classes. So, why not one of the standard Koine grammars? Why Athenese?
Well, now that I'm thinking about it, I actually started. There's this like New Testament Greek online. I think like this free, like kind of. So I started there, and just was like working through stuff, and if you're working through the grammar, you're like, I could not actually read anything,
right.
And understand it. I could pronounce all the sounds, but even that wasn't very good. But I started there, and then I believe John Schwant had a course that used Athenese. So I got the textbooks and started working through that course. And then also, I found Athenese early on to be like pretty helpful, just because it engages like, more of the language learning pieces
Yeah.
than in, other more traditional textbooks. Um, at the same time, I was in Hebrew class, with I was so this was at the University of Georgia, so it was not a like Christian school or you know anything like that. So basically, at the University of Georgia, in my Hebrew class, it was kind of this like mixed Hebrew and or like modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew kind of course, and there were a lot of Jews in there. In fact, there were only like three or four of us that weren't, and they could all speak modern Hebrew. So I immediately recognized that they were really, really good at the language compared to me, who was just trying to fumble through the grammar. And so that to me gave me a taste of um, learning Greek in a way that would be different, right? Like if I could do the same thing for Greek, as they did for Hebrew, I would be much better. So and Authentic Day kind of gave me a small window into that. And I just started looking for resources in order to kind of develop that proficiency.
So, okay. So again, here's another first, I think, for people I've talked to. So it was Hebrew and exposure to people who are using Hebrew and more communicative methods that got you thinking, well, I can do this for Greek. Is that kind of what I'm
Yeah,
understanding?
yeah, for sure.
Interesting.
And so I was just looking for all kinds of resources, and so that kind of led me to like the BLC material, and eventually led me to Israel, where I got my PhD in Hebrew and took classes at the Police Institute.
Olson's good.
And so that's where I actually like learned to speak Greek, at Police. But up until that point, I had still gone through like a decent amount of material, that was like, just more like usage based material than your traditional Greek textbook. And honestly, I didn't really have a ton of exposure. I mean, I didn't ever take a Greek 101 course in a seminary. So I actually went to seminary for a semester. I'd already read through Mounts on my own. Or
Mhm.
no, sorry, not Mounts, Wallace. So I basically was, doing a lot of stuff on my own, and then I read through Wallace. And so I was like, you know, like pretty good at the grammar. So I just tested out of like the first two courses in seminary. Um, and then and at the time too, so when I went to seminary, which again was only for a semester, but I only read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. I just like refused to read it in English. I was not that good at Greek and Hebrew. I mean, not anything. I mean, I wasn't, I was good for that context, but I wasn't nearly as good as I would be in Israel. So I just said to myself, like, I've got to learn these languages better. So I just like, would carry my Greek and Hebrew Bible around everywhere. Um, so that also kind of, just forced you into using it more.
Okay. So you started with you're in a Hebrew class, and then you picked up Athenese and into Greek Online or whatever the website was, and started learning there, kind of on your own, working through a Greek course. Um, and then what was the next step that got you from there to carrying around a Bible and just getting input that way?
Yeah, so it really was I mean just so I read through Wallace, and then I just started trying to read.
Okay.
I mean I actually had Nick actually, my partner at Biblingo, he was with me at UG at the time, and he took a Greek course in the classics department and at UGA, and started with Authentic as well. So I could see, like again, the benefits in that. And like I said, I've never actually taken a Greek 101 course in seminary, so I don't really know what it's like, in some respects, but in other respects, I know, exactly what it's like. But like I didn't, I just I didn't go the Mounts route, the typical,
Yeah.
kind of thing. But so once I read through Wallace though, you just kind of muster your way through vocabulary, and you just get a Greek reader's Bible and you just go for it. And that was kind of my philosophy.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Makes a lot of sense. I think I did have a Greek 101 course, but essentially like what got me to any level of competency is basically what you said. It's like a lot of exposure and reading and looking things up in grammars as I needed to know how a construction worked, and then just moving along and trying to get vocab down. Um, okay,
Yeah,
so
for
that
sure. And I again, like, to me, the shift between like pre and post Israel, like, to me, that is the like defining moment. It was like, well, like there's everything before Israel and then everything after Israel in terms of like my knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. I mean, so like people would have said that I knew Greek. Well, I mean, I was only reading the Bible in Greek. But I just did not come anywhere close to understanding it like I would once I just started speaking it and using it communicatively. I mean, it was just a night and day difference. Because I just hadn't like I really hadn't internalized the language like I would in Israel.
okay, so yeah, so tell me about Israel. What happened there? You know, I guess how did you find out about said police? I think you'd mentioned. So yeah, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I mean, I went over there to do my PhD in Hebrew. And but my big goal was like I want to learn these languages really, really well. And I don't even know how I mean, I was always looking online for resources to learn Greek and Hebrew, and I think I just like Googled, um, you know, something like the Police Institute. I mean, I happened to find it on Google is my point. And so I saw that they were in Jerusalem, and I was like, I'm going there to do my PhD in Hebrew. This is how I'm going to learn Greek at the same time. So I would, bus back and forth from the university to Polis. But yeah, that experience. I mean, so I had already had. I can't remember if I had read through the New Testament, the whole thing by the time I got there or not. But I mean, it was close to it if I hadn't done the whole thing. But um, I like because I'd already had a decent amount of exposure. Once you're in the classroom setting and everything's in Greek, everything just starts like clicking so much faster. And this was kind of like the experience, like students across the board there. Like if you are like brand new to Greek, it can be a lot, and a lot of people say like, oh, it's too fast. But if you already have a background, it's really ideal because they throw so much at you, but because you've already had exposure, you can just like soak up a lot really quickly. So yeah, I mean, I that's where I just started learning the languages to a different degree and really started to develop intuitions. And that's the key difference is before that, if you had asked me to produce anything, I couldn't. And now, like, if you ask me to produce something, I will have intuitions about how to say it. It might not always be right? I mean, because I don't have native speaker intuitions. But I'll have an idea of like
Right.
how you would say this and how you would construct this. And that definitely flows into how you understand the text, because you use those same intuitions when you're reading.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the big benefits, just personally for reading. It's like as I've read more and more, it's like you read something like, oh, that's this. It's very similar to what they said over here, or that word was used over here in this way, and like you catch those connections that um, you're just going to lose in translation because translation necessitates that things have to be translated in context, and so we have different glosses for things based on context in English, and you lose that concordance, I guess.
Yeah, and really, it's a push for reading quickly as well. Because if you don't read
Yeah,
fast enough, you will miss the discourse level connections, which are there. But if you're taking 10 minutes to read one paragraph, you won't be able to see the connection between Romans 1 and whatever in Romans 5 that like actually is connected because that it's actually still one letter, right?
right.
And so and without being able to, I mean, just get through enough text, you don't see those kinds of things.
But I think it's true for I mean, in any language, we don't read a paragraph in 10 minutes and think, we're reading. That's not how literature works. In whether it's Plato or Homer or Greek Bible, it's people would have read large chunks. So I think the ability to do that's really important too. Um,
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big problems in our field in general is really even just a lack of definition of what reading is and a lack of like critical self-reflection. I mean, people actually don't learn to read in Greek courses because they don't like know enough vocabulary to read. I mean, it's just like at the end of the day, like, I mean, the second language acquisition literature says you need to know like 98% of the words
right.
in order for it to be meaning focused reading. And like most people just never get there. Um, and so because of that, like you're doing something, but like it might be valuable, right? But it's just not the same thing as when you are sitting down and reading a novel in English, right? And you're getting this like grand idea of the story. That's just not the same thing as um what people will call like exegesis of like a Greek text or whatever. um and you're like analyzing it very closely. I mean, that's fine. It's just not reading.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely um a different experience. And one of the things I find so interesting is like if you look at the statistics, like John has about 1,000 lemmas, 1,000 dictionary entries in it. It's about what 18,000 words, I think. Um, and so like that's a reasonable rate of vocab to repetitions. Um, so I just find it really interesting that there's no textbook. Like, have you ever looked at Clyde Farr's Homeric Greek?
I know of it, but I haven't actually looked at it.
So it's public domain now, um,
Okay.
which is cool. But it's basically built. It's built around getting you through Iliad Book One, and it just blows me away that no one has done that, like copied that same thing for John's Gospel, because like relatively small vocab, pretty long book, or do it for Genesis or for Judges, where it's like 30,000 words with 2,000 lemmas, probably 300 of which are all proper names. So those are free, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or you can get through it with footnotes. So it's like, anyway, it's kind of off topic, but that's just one of those things that sits in the back of my head. Like, why doesn't this exist yet?
Yeah. Yeah, no, for
Um,
sure. I mean, again, if you look at Mounds, I think the textbook has like 450 words ish. And so the problem is like you're never gonna make it. Like with that amount of words,
right.
you can't read John at the end because like what you're doing. I mean, you could call it like intensive reading or something like that, but like not just normal reading. And you can't sit down and read the book because you don't know all the words, right? And that's where like vocabulary is like the number one predictor in how well you can understand a text. And it's not grammar. I mean, you can like even in English when second language learners talk to us, if they use a wrong tense, if they say like I go to store now, like, oh, I know exactly what you're saying, right? But if they say like I swim to store now, then you don't know, like what do you mean by that, right? And so like vocabulary is like just the number one thing you need to read. And it's just you don't get far enough in pretty much any of the major textbooks to actually sit down and read a text.
So yeah, I totally agree. Um, so one of my usual questions is, what did you do to get over the intermediate plateau? But I think you've answered that, right? Like that was polis for you, um, and that kind of taking all that knowledge you've gotten through reading and Athenese and those, and then bringing that into like an active sort of active competency, right? Is that like a fair summary?
Yeah, for sure. I will say though, at Police, at the time I was learning probably too many languages at one time. And I really couldn't devote the time to Greek outside of the classroom in like the first year that I really wanted to. In the second year, what I did, and so the problem with Police is like what happens a lot of times is, well, this happens every time. The teacher talks the most, right? And so like the teacher gets very good at speaking Greek. Um, and this is like, again, I think this is like pretty universally, uh, at least when I was there as a student, is universally accepted by the students that the teacher is getting better than all of us at a faster rate. Um, and your opportunities to speak in class are fairly limited. Um, and so what I started to do was I took a friend and said, "Hey, we're we're gonna do one-on-one, ask each other questions in Greek, 45 minutes a day, for the next however long." And we just like stayed in Greek and like we are just using Greek and honestly Greek that we know. And that to me, that combined with Polish was really the big thing that helped me over the intermediate hump. So like I having the opportunity to speak in that kind of setting is different than a classroom setting,
Mm,
where you are, one on one or one to a few people, and you have this like concentrated practice that's on your level, and you are asked to speak, a third of the time or half the time.
yeah.
That gives you just so many more reps than even in the classroom. You can get like I was very good at listening, um, and that has a lot of carryover to the other skills. But it still production is like really key in language learning. And I think there's literature to back that up, and you just need the right environment in order to do that.
Yeah. I think the difficulty in language learning is the right conditions.
Yeah,
And that's a balance of materials and, like you said, having people you can communicate with, materials and context. It's kind of a combination of, can you find all that stuff?
yeah,
And I think the challenge has been that, for so many years, maybe the past century, really, Greek has been, vastly under resourced in terms of all of those things.
yeah.
Um, so So I want to get into Biblingo in a little bit, but let me just ask you one question. What do you do now to continue to improve um, as a Greek speaker, Greek user?
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest thing now is just reading a bunch of texts. And honestly, like, again, me reading now is actually very different than me reading, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, when I didn't know it as well, because what I'm doing now is reading. And back then it was like, you know, every, 4 or 5 words, I'd be looking at a gloss, right? And so it was very, very difficult to get through large chunks of text. And so like right now I'm reading through the Greek Bible in a year. And I'm a little bit behind, and I'm gonna have to like, hurry up to catch up. But I mean I've still read, I don't know, 1,000 pages of Greek this year. Which is a lot. So I'm like, and honestly, that's the thing, is that like it's very hard to find people to speak Greek with. So I'll randomly talk to my 7-month-old in Greek. But my other kids won't tolerate it anymore.
Uh-huh.
So other than that, like I just don't have the space to practice, and I don't really have the time right now. But yeah, that's if I did have some space, definitely getting like conversation partners, to like read a text with in Greek and talk about it in Greek. I
Yeah.
mean, that would be the kind of thing that I think would be ideal.
I've been chewing on the idea of doing like a Zoom Bible study kind of thing where it's just do the whole thing in Greek, read, start with First John, something easy, and just read through it and talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, but again, haven't tried to create that, but
Yeah,
um,
I used to do that. I don't know if you know Jordash. He would do that with Jordash Kifiak with a group of people. So, I had joined that several times. Jordash and just a few other people in that world. And we would just, I think we were reading through like uh First Kingdoms, and we would just read through text and just talk about it in Greek, right? And that's the kind of thing that, like, yeah, it's very hard to find people that can and are willing to do that.
yeah,
So anyway,
yeah. So that it's interesting too. I'm just thinking about other people I've talked to, and one of the things that um, I did an interview with Luke Ranieri. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he talked a lot about using readers like Thrasymachus or Rouse's Greek Boy at Home, and like just getting tons and tons of repetition for some of those, you essentially textbooks that are really more reading, natural method oriented kind of thing. So even I think for beginners, like once you've done Athanase, you could do something like that. If you're still not at the point, you could sit down and read the Greek Bible or read, whatever your target text is. You could still get tons of real reading just on a simpler text. And thankfully, we're starting to see some more of those. So hopefully that's a helpful way forward for beginners who might be sort of stuck in that space between, I finished my Greek 1 and 2, but I can't quite go into the wilds of real Greek yet.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I would suggest to people, would be if you can't like produce it in like a real meaningful conversation, then you should at least be reading out loud some of the time. And people don't really understand, like, I mean, though, there's a whole like pronunciation thing with the Greek world. But like actually pronouncing the words, like I pick your pronunciation. Okay. I mean, I don't think that's, that important of a thing. Again, I know people disagree with me on that, but it actually pronouncing the words out loud actually does affect how you read. And like you do go through phonology to get to meaning, and that's just like how our brains read. I mean, if you look at like the literature on the neuroscience of reading, you are necessarily going through the sound system in order to get to the meaning when you are reading. So if you don't have the sound system in place, like you're really not reading. And that's a really key component that is just neglected. Like it's within these Greek classrooms. It's like if you don't know how to pronounce things right, then you're not going to be able to read fluently. Like it just doesn't work. So that would be another thing I would suggest. And reading out loud is not perfect in the sense that like you're not constructing your own meaning, but you're just by getting the sounds, you're doing a lot for yourself. And it has so many other benefits, but just like I would say, if you don't have that space, some of your reading should be out loud.
Well, and the nice thing is sort of, as far as I'm aware of, regardless of what pronunciation scheme you pick, after you've got it, like it's not like English where the word could be spelled the same way as other things how to predict, how to read, but it's pronounced completely differently. Like once you have a pronunciation scheme, reading is essentially phonetic.
Yep.
Now if you're trying to listen to a different scheme, then understanding grammar and things like that might be a different story. But at least the pronouncing, it's pretty straightforward once you get it down.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, so tell me about Biblingo. How did you get from I've done PhD in Hebrew and Polish and speaking and things like that. How did you move that towards, like, how did that become Biblingo?
Yeah, well, Biblingo was before that. So Biblingo
that.
was really the idea for sure. So like I went to get my master's in linguistics for Bible translation. And I thought that I would go to do this degree and they would have the resources to learn Greek and Hebrew because they know how to learn languages in general because they are linguists, right? And so, I took a class on second language acquisition and like none of the principles in that SLA class are applied in their Greek and Hebrew classes. And so I was very confused. And I still distinctly remember, walking on this campus. And I was like there is actually no resource. Like, I mean, there are all these resources out there for modern languages to, use a computer to learn Greek and Hebrew in a way that incorporates SLA methods. And there isn't one in for Greek or Hebrew. So this was back in like 2015. And so I was like, like that has to happen, and I'll just do it. So I mean, I started it then, in the like very very early, seed thought idea phases. Um, so that was before I went to Israel. When I went to Israel, I realized, obviously, like, I think part of the struggle was I needed to get better at the languages. And so when I was in Israel, realized like, oh, this is actually like doable now, because I'm in this environment where I'm learning the languages, and we're in a context. So part of what you learn in my second language acquisition class was called second language and culture acquisition. So the and culture piece is pretty important when you're learning a language, and it's underplayed. But what I realized was, being in Israel, I could actually you know recreate the culture as much as we possibly can there, and kind of bring that into the Greek and Hebrew learning world. So like all of those kinds of pieces started fitting together. So in 2018 we started filming. So I just started like I actually taught Greek for University of the Holy Land for a semester, and from that just started building out the curriculum.
Hmm.
Was writing sentences in Greek, and having people just like work through a grammatical progression. And then we just started filming these sentences with people dressed up in first century garb at reconstructed places and all around Israel, and just started pairing those with the sentences. And so that's really how Biblingo started. Really, it was really a twofold desire. One was I wanted a resource to learn Greek and Hebrew. So there was like definitely
Yep.
that was like I want to get better at this language. Like, how do I do it? That was an initial impetus. I mean, once I went to Israel, I just learned it better. But second, the really big one was for Bible translators. So I don't know if how familiar you are with the Bible translation world, but basically every translation is done from a translation. So like I was involved in a project in Mexico. We were translating into Nahuatl, which is an Aztec language. And basically what they did was they took a Spanish version, they translated that into Nahuatl, and then they translated that back into English. And I came in and checked that English translation against the Hebrew because no one on the team knew Hebrew. So you're talking about like many steps removed from the original text. And so my thinking was like, well, they just need a resource to learn Hebrew, right? Like they just need some way to learn the language so that I don't have to fly over there and check their translation of a translation of a translation against the original, right? Um, and so that was one of the big things. And obviously, like, we're much broader than just a translation world, and we like want to help more people than just that. But that was one of the big initial like impetuses. It was just to get was to empower people that really needed Greek and Hebrew, and that really had no way to learn the languages as it stands now.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Um, and like we said, it's Greek is under resourced, Hebrew probably even more so. So your goal is to help provide a way for people to learn, basically create the resource you wish you'd had.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So you've mentioned second language acquisition, and I love your podcast too. By the way, I've listened to that and learned quite a bit of really good bits. I love Paul Nation's 4 streams. It's just such a great way to think about how to build a language learning routine.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see that's woven into how Biblingo works. So that's and also like so you have a degree in linguistics, yes?
Yeah. So my master's
Well,
in
probably a couple.
linguistics. Yeah. So I my master's in linguistics and my PhD is like technically in Hebrew, but basically all my courses were in the linguistics department. So like at Hebrew U, it's like if you're in Hebrew, you're either straddling linguistics and Hebrew or Hebrew and Bible. And I straddled Hebrew and linguistics. So that like basically my PhD is in linguistics. So to me, like that's really what I wanted. I wanted to be able to apply it, especially to Greek as well, because once you learn the theory, like once you learn, I mean, in this case, like SLA stuff, it's pretty much all the same, right? I mean, there's like slight variations, but pretty much you would teach any language in the same way. Again, well, they are very large overarching principles that would stay constant. So let's just put it that way.
So let me just pose this question then. For the average learner, how helpful do you think some elementary grasp of linguistics is for someone who wants to learn Greek?
It depends on what they mean by learn Greek.
Hmm.
So you don't need linguistics to learn Greek, right? I mean, no native speaker of ancient Greek knew linguistics. So that's okay, right? They knew how to use the language. And so, like, the problem is that in today's discussion on like what it means to know and learn Greek,
Hmm.
people actually mean something different, right? They
Right.
mean you can look at ho anthropos and say that's nominative case, right? Um, like who cares, right? If you can use that noun phrase in the right way every time, right? then you are a user of Greek, right? But you don't need to know that that's nominative case in order to know Greek in that way. So like, I mean, with Biblingo, we try to teach you both because like you do need to be aware that when you open up a commentary, which is a lot of people, that's what they're doing. You need to know what nominative case is, right? And personally, I think and this is like my research. I mean, I think linguistics has a lot to offer. New Testament Greek grammarians in their analysis of New Testament Greek, and I think there's a massive amount of work that can be done in this respect. I mean, there is, and I'm trying to do a lot of it, or I'm trying to start some of it, but that's just a completely different thing. Like I can speak Greek to my kids, and as long as I use it consistently and in a meaningful way, they don't have to know any of the grammar, right? They just have to figure out how I'm using the words and the meaning that I'm using with those words. So personally, I think that like if you want to be a serious exegete, of the Bible, you need to do both. Like you
Hmm.
need to be up to date on the latest grammatical information. There is a lot of misinformation in New Testament Greek grammar because a lot of the people that are writing the textbooks are not up to date on the linguistics, right? And so and because it's its own separate field, they're not getting checked by linguists, right? And so I would say, you need to be up to date there, right? And so don't necessarily go to the New Testament Greek grammars for it. Go to the linguistics, textbooks for it. But then you should be able to use Greek, right? If you can't use Greek, like, again, if you're writing a linguistics textbook, you would either talk about a language or you would have language informants, right? That's how it would work. Like you can't talk about the grammar of a language that you don't know if you don't have a native speaker or someone that knows the language to tell you how the language is used, right? And so like if you want to be really good, you need to learn how to use the language, just like you would learn Spanish, right? And really use Spanish, right? And so that would be my push, is that you should just do both.
Well, I think critically, the way we do that, at least in English, is you learn to speak the language, and then you learn the meta. You learn the analysis, you learn the
Yep.
mechanics, and all that stuff comes later. Like you don't know what a noun is when you're 3. You learn that in elementary school or whatever
Yep.
after you're already a competent speaker.
Yeah.
And we've sort of flipped that cart on its head. We flipped that on its head in most classical and biblical Greek courses, where we start with here's the analysis language to talk about Greek, and then that's where most people stay, is with an
Yep.
ability to maybe discuss the language but with very little ability to use it.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like
No,
Biblingo, you're aiming more at the here, let's get you the ability while incorporating some of the meta language, um, as well.
yeah. Yeah. So I think there is, I mean, this is where I would push back against some of the more communicative guys is like second language acquisition is not the same thing as first language acquisition. Like it's just well known that it's not. I mean, it's just, and so like you're going to like teach Greek differently to a 20-year-old college student than you would to a 2-year-old who you're trying to get them, just to use Greek, right? Like those should not be the same thing. And
Right.
so it's okay to say, here's this pattern. We call this nominative case. Like that's not a bad thing, right? And then some people in the communicative world say like, oh, well, you should just like absorb it. Well, like that's fine, but you can absorb it through 1,000 uses, um, you know, in all in the same kind of context. Or I can spend 30 seconds in the beginning, tell you, oh, this marks the subject. Now let's use it, right? In that way. And people don't have to be confused when they start, right? And this is what I saw a lot in taking classes at Police and BLC, which are just very, very committed to the immersive method, which I think like the immersive method, like it forces you to learn to comprehend the language, which is good. But like again, in Paul Nation's work, right, there is a strand of language focused learning that you would just discuss a paradigm in a language you can understand. And it's a small part of what you're doing, but it's still part, right? And so I would say that that information is still useful. It's useful for a learner, even if you're only trying to learn to use the language. It's useful for a learner to be told explicitly, this is what the paradigm is, this is how it works, very quickly. Now you can go use it and practice it, rather than them just trying to, figure out things sort of on the fly. I mean, I think there is a genuine place for that.
I think that's where I think that's where adults have an advantage over kids in language learning is that we have the experience of learning a language. So if the conditions are right, so that our brain is internalizing, then we can apply those other learning skills we picked up through our life to
Yep.
learn quicker and
Yep. For sure.
systematize that internalized knowledge of, oh yeah, these things are really, oh, this is a pattern. It's these things go together and this is how it works. And oh,
Yep.
these words are actually alike. And I bet I can predict that this other word is going to work like that because I know this pattern.
Yep.
Like we can apply those cognitive skills that a young child can't do.
Right.
Um,
It
but the,
is explicit knowledge. We can have explicit knowledge about the grammar that we can then make implicit through practice, right? But if you don't have the explicit knowledge, then what you're going to end up doing is kind of you're just going to like perpetuate these sort of grammar mistakes, right? And this is what my kids do, like my 3-year-old all the time, right? We'll make the same mistakes. And like if I tell him, this is how it works, right? He's still probably going to make the same mistake,
yeah,
right? Um, and but we can then the next time we go to see that construction or go to produce that language, whatever it is, we can say we can remember that. We can remember our explicit knowledge and we say, oh, okay, like actually, I need to correct myself, right? And so I completely agree. Obviously, like we need to use the language to make that knowledge implicit. Explicit knowledge is not going to like make it implicit. I mean, it's honestly, I feel like, I mean, I've used this analogy all the time, but it's like when you're learning an instrument, it's not like you just throw out all mechanics, right? It's just like, oh, I'm just gonna play by ear, and when it sounds good, I'm done, right? It's like no, like you're gonna study the technique and the mechanics and all of those things, but that doesn't make you a good like violinist, right? You actually have to do the thing, right? But then what you should do is record yourself, right? See what you're doing and then change what you're doing based on, explicit meta knowledge, right? That you can have as an adult. Um, and that's where I think, again, some of the communicative guys, I think could be helped by incorporating more of that stuff.
yeah. And again, it seems like maybe a little bit of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. of like we've had so much grammar translation, so much explicit knowledge, and hoping that that will become something, which it won't. Um, so that now there's some people are just pushing it the other way and saying, well, we're going to do all implicit and hope that that will work. And it seems
Yeah.
like Biblingo's approach and what Paul Nation is talking about is like you split your time between the four different strands, and the explicit stuff gets like a quarter of your time.
Right.
So instead of being 99%, now it's quarter, which
Right.
seems a much more balanced approach that lets us use, like you said, intensive practice and all the other learning skills that people have developed, um, throughout their lifetime to learn their language. So it just seems like a balanced approach is a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that, and I think the other big piece, that I think we need more of just in general is just the progression. I mean, I think in the communicative world, it's very, very easy to get for students to get overwhelmed very quickly,
Yeah.
because there's so much input thrown at you, and so much input that is actually not comprehensible because you only know, two of the three words in a sentence, or really like two of the four. If you know two of the four words, you're probably not going to get the sentence, right? If you know two of the three, you might get the sentence, but you might not, right? And so this is where it like the immersion kind of method really makes input the main thing, which is important, but it's comprehensible input that has to be there, right? And so like you can step into a Greek class and learn nothing, even if you're immersed in the language, right? Because if it's not comprehensible, then it's not going to help you learn the language. And so I think in addition to that, I think just like getting the progression to the point where people are always feeling like they're progressing, and they feel like they are always learning something and it's never overwhelming. That's, I think, the key. They should never feel like, oh, I don't know anything you just said to me, right? And this is like such a normal feeling,
Right.
In a second language classroom, where it's like someone rattles off something in language that's not your first language. You're like, I have no idea what you said. Please just start all the way over. But that's what we're striving not to be. We're like, Biblingo, we're trying to make everything comprehensible. Basically so that you can continue to progress and feel motivated and confident in what you're doing.
That's I was actually I was reading a book I found in the used bookstore on TPRS, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, and like that's one of the points I love that they made is like we don't want to waste time on establishing meaning. We want to get repetitions so that they can internalize and remember and acquire the vocabulary. So just say what the word means in English. I mean, it may not be exact, right? I mean, we know that different languages, words have different ranges of meaning, and it's not going to match up, but give them whatever's close enough so they get a gist of what it means, and then can move on to understanding and getting enough comprehensible reps to learn the vocab. And another point they made that I thought was really good too was grammar is an unknown. So, we can throw, they might know all the words, but the grammar might be new. So there's still something there they have to acquire. So, limit that cognitive burden so that they can, like you said, not feel overwhelmed. And I guess I was going to say, I guess too, with one of the flip sides of that is that something like Biblingo might feel really slow paced, potentially because you're trying to limit that overwhelm and give people enough exposure to, to the words and to the structures that they're actually moving along at a rate that they're going to remember and grow and actually get somewhere, instead of trying to go too fast, get overwhelmed and quit. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've never had anyone tell us you're going too slow.
Yeah.
Because most of the time people come in this, they're like, they've never used Greek in this way, right? And so it's like everything's kind of new, even if you've been in a seminary classroom. But again, I think like Krashen's kind of suggestion for this, and I like Krashen too, within the like SLA world, like he had a lot of pushback from what he, the input hypothesis and some of his suggestions. But within the biblical studies communicative world, like Krashen's kind of the king, which makes sense if you're focusing on input. But this is a guy, again, it's 1985, right? So we're almost talking about 40 years ago. There's been a ton of work in SLA since then, right?
Yeah.
That being said, all that being said, one of the key insights was like you should be at the level of I plus one. I meaning the knowledge that the student currently has, plus one meaning one new element. So the problem is that if you have a sentence where there are two new elements, grammar and a new vocab word, right? It's often too hard for the student to comprehend the full sentence, which means that sentence was, not wasted, but possibly wasted, right? Because they didn't understand. Like the whole point is comprehensible, right? And so if they didn't comprehend it, right, then you're not getting what you really want out of that input. And so that is another, I think, really key point, is treating basically every single morpheme in the language should be treated like its own separate thing that the student needs to learn, and they need to learn it one at a time. And that's what we do. Like when we introduce one morpheme at a time. So like if like in the first lesson, you're gonna learn 6 vocabulary words, and then you're gonna learn, how to use those 6 vocabulary words with a single grammar topic. And if you do more than that, like what you're risking is you're risking them not learning either. Right. If you teach 2 grammar topics at one point, at one time, it's they might not learn either grammar point, right? And so I think that's a huge point, and again, a huge like insight of Krashen's is it always has to be on their level, and their level is at most they can learn one new thing at one time.
And another, I think it's there hiding under the surface, but grammar is a way of constructing meaning and communicating, right? So it's not just a bunch of abstract rules. Like these sentences mean something, so you have to actually treat them like vocabulary. Treat these morphemes and these structures as, like you said, an item to learn, because it's a way of communicating meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is just as much I mean, again, that's why I said morphemes, right? Any meaningful unit in the language like needs to be learned, because you can't. What's going to happen is, the first language will just necessarily be inputted into that structure, right? Because they don't have anything else, right? So if you're just gonna like guess at a meaning for the morpheme, like they're gonna, or a meaning for the syntax or whatever, they're just gonna guess their first language, right? Because that's all they know, right? Or their second or third language, but they're not gonna just like, they have to fill the gap, right? So like if you have like just before this conversation I was working on word order. So like if you have SOV word order in Greek, like people are going to think something about it, right? And what they will probably think is some sort of thing that's related to their first language, right? I mean, that's just like, or some theoretical construct that they heard from someone else, right? Those are the options. And so, you have to be, and I think this is where like semantics is really key. You just have to be really, really careful about what these things mean and how you teach them. And that really is dependent upon your analysis. Anyway, so this is, one of the big reasons why, I mean, this is all my research right now, right? Of just trying to figure out what all the morphemes mean. That's basically the short of it.
Well, we've been at this for around an hour, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it. I think we have a lot of similar thoughts on topics and backgrounds too, it sounds like. But let me just end with 2 questions. One is, what are you currently working on? And the second is, where can people find you?
Yeah. So the first one is, I mean, I am working on Greek and Hebrew textbooks right now. So basically these will be paired with Biblingo. The basic like sort of like 2 arguments of the book are, one is, if you want to be a good exegete, you should be fluent. And there's a definition of fluent in the SLA literature.
Yeah.
that I'm working off of. But basically, if you want to read deeply, you need to read quickly, and there is a correlation between the two. And the second one is that really we should just be getting our theoretical constructs on what all of these grammatical things mean from linguistics proper. And that's the best place to get them. So basically, these textbooks will be introducing, some of the more, just the grammatical terms in more linguistically oriented ways. So, talking about tense, aspect, modality, it's as an easy example. The way linguists talk about them, and not necessarily how New Testament Greek grammarians talk about them. I guess again, it's just a different set of literature. So I'm working on textbooks for both Greek and Hebrew. They're like, I don't know, 75% done, both of them. So I'm hoping to finish them in the next few months. And then people can find me really, I have an academia page. So like, that's like more me personally. But Biblingo, .org is obviously where the software lives, and Kevin at Biblingo.org is, easy enough to find online for for anyone to have my email address. So, that's what I'm doing right now.
Well, cool. That sounds great. I'm definitely excited for those textbooks, because it really was linguistics that made grammar, English grammar, whatever grammar, make sense to me. So, I imagine that will bring a lot of clarity to people who might be trying to struggle out, what on earth is an aorist participle, etc. So that'll be great. Definitely looking forward to that. So again, Kevin, thank you for your time, and maybe we'll have you back sometime and find out more what's the next thing that Biblingo is going at. So
that was great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under Creative Commons 3.0 Attribution License. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.